Right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural lecture this evening. And it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Anthony Kauder to give his inaugural. As you know, these are important events for the university in terms of highlighting the expertise that we have within the university and giving our professors the challenge, and it really is a challenge, of describing what they've done or what they intend to do to an audience that will sort of range from, I'm sure, experts in the room to biologists like me who probably don't quite understand even some of the title. But that really is the challenge of these lectures, so I think we're looking forward to it. Anthony's been a bit of a traveller in his time, and he gained his bachelor's in history and German from the Hamilton College in upstate New York, and then he came to London and he embarked on his MA in international history at LSE. And following that, he went to Oxford, to St Anthony's College, to do his PhD, and his thesis was on the political reactions to antisemitism in the Weimar Republic. And then he really did go on his travels, I think, teaching English in South America, German in Frankfurt, and then got a PGCE in Oxford. And while doing that, trying to learn some Hebrew in the Israeli desert town of Arad. But he then returned to academia and started writing books, in particular on West German democratization and the relationship with the Jewish community in the Federal Republic. He came to Kiel the first time, I think, in 2005. I don't know whether he decided he didn't like it, but then he left after a year to then do a 2-year research grant at the University of Munich, but then came back in 2010, he then went to Munich on a 3-year funded project. But then since then, he's researching the history of hypnosis and psychosomatic medicine, so a whole range of different topics as well. He's written 4 monographs, edited 5 volumes, and published over 40 articles. Clearly important markers. I know we all worry about metrics and markers, but unless you publish and get people to read what you're thinking and what you're doing, then actually it doesn't have the impact either in the academic community or beyond. So today he's going to tell us, I think, a little bit about what he's done, also a bit about what he intends to do. So it's my great pleasure to ask Anthony to the stage to give us his talk on an interdisciplinary love affair, history, psychology, and the study of anti-Semitism.
This is more comfortable. Thanks, Trevor, for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank a few people in the audience for their help. First and foremost, perhaps, Ed Rowan for his therapeutic advice concerning armors and how to get rid of armors. I'm talking about psychological armors, not the heavier armors. I want to thank Aristotle for coming all the way from Edinburgh, which is extremely kind. And I want to thank all of you here for coming to this hall this evening, although we're all quite concerned about what's going to happen at around 7 o'clock, I think, this evening. So if 1 or 2 or even 5 or 6 of you occasionally stare at your smartphones, I have no problems with that. Perhaps don't intervene, don't tell me what's happening, because the news will be depressing anyway. But please do so. I won't be upset about that. Now, when I was asked to give this talk, I got a letter from Trevor explaining to me that I should think about a wide audience and not just experts. I considered former presentations, former talks, what did the others do, how can I learn from the others, what is the best approach. And I decided, in my case, the best approach would be to start with this person here. That's me. It was me. It was me. When I start in the first year of history, explaining history to my students and what history is about and how history perhaps differs from other disciplines, I start often with a timeline. And I start drawing miserable stick figures of a little baby on the left and an adult on the right. And the adult is the adult student at Kiel, aged 18, and the little baby is that student as a baby, aged 1 month or whatever. And I asked the students, how did you get to Kiel? Right? There are one or two maybe in here who remember this, and surprisingly, most students these days talk about the last few months before they got to Kiel. Right? They talk about meeting fellow students who went to Kiel, or former students who went to Kiel. They talk about the fact that a guidance counselor in school recommended Kiel in their final year, or that they live nearby, something like that. Strange to a certain extent for someone of my age, because my approach would be, of course, thinking about class, thinking about long-term trends, etc. But for today's students, these things are perhaps less important, and that's an interesting phenomenon. So I thought I need to do the same thing this evening, briefly, not so briefly, and be fair towards those students and towards all the students who've suffered because of this little experiment, and do the same thing with me. Okay? Minus stick figures, minus the stick figures. Oh, I know I have this here. I always forget I have this thing here. This is, on the bottom is my father, with his sister, with his brother, sometime in the 1940s. In New York, not upon arriving to New York, obviously, because they're holding up some documents, probably naturalization documents, in any event, proud that they had sort of obtained these documents, that they had made it to the States, but they had come from a completely different place, of course, and that is Vienna. My father was born in Vienna in 1938, and he had to flee Vienna with his family, and he spent a brief time in Trieste, then in Italy. Then they moved to Palestine, spent some time in Tel Aviv. Then they had to move on. They spent a few weeks in Baghdad and a few weeks in what was then Bombay. And eventually, they came to New York and stayed there for quite some time. Now, the interesting thing about my father is not this emigration story. It's an important story for me. It's an interesting story perhaps for others. But the really interesting thing about my father is that in 1964, he returned to Europe. That didn't happen very often. Okay? So in 1964, he returned to Europe. His siblings didn't. His siblings didn't want to have anything to do with Europe. And the children of his siblings were always completely uninterested. I'm exaggerating perhaps, but they really haven't been until this day interested in where this family came from. So they rarely, if ever, visited Europe. Europe was the past. The United States was the future. Now, one question would be, of course, why my father? And the other question would be, why does this matter to me as a historian? Right? We're not talking about me as some special human being, but as a historian of German Jewish history and also of the reception of psychoanalysis, etc., etc. Well, it would have mattered less had my father not decided to return to Germany. He had come from Austria, but he, for various reasons, decided to return to Europe and to go to Germany, to Munich. And Munich today is a beautiful city. It was a pretty city back then as well, but it's a beautiful city, very attractive to all sorts of people, to a lot of Britons as well. But returning to Munich, or moving to Munich as a Jew whose family had to flee, parts of the family also died in camps, was very unusual. Yeah? So if we move to Munich today, and I live in Munich sometimes, partly I live in part of the year I also live in Munich because my wife happens to be from Munich. Today it's interesting, attractive, but not really important. But my father at the time decided to move to Munich. Now, if you move to Munich in 1964 as a Jew, you're confronted with guilt. And your family members telling you, why the hell did you do this? How on earth can you live in a place like this on blood-soaked soil? So my father had to justify himself, as did many other Jews who continued to live after the Holocaust in Germany because they had been DPs from Eastern Europe, or a few who had returned from Palestine and then Israel. These people were constantly confronted with the fact that they lived in this God-forsaken land. So how do you deal with that? You compromise. Okay? One compromise was, in our case, you go to local sports clubs, but you go to an English language school, an international school. Another compromise is not all Germans are Nazis, but all gray-haired men on the street are Nazis. Okay? So there's the psychological aspect of trying to deal with this problem by compromising all the time, finding reasons, and so on and so forth. I wrote a book about this, how Jews in Germany try to deal with their guilt. They try to pretend to be the guarantors of democracy, for instance, or the intermediaries between West Germany and Israel, all sorts of things that especially officials, German Jewish officials, did to assuage their feelings of guilt. Even so, why should this matter to me as a historian? Right? Strange constellations do not produce historians. Okay, I became a historian, as you know, and I may have become a historian because of these feelings of guilt that were transferred to me and not to my siblings, but you have feelings of guilt and don't become an academic or an historian. Perhaps because I was the firstborn. Maybe that played a role, I don't know. Even so, when I then began to study history, I wasn't that interested in Jewish history, anti-Semitism in the beginning. I studied history proper, then, as Trevor mentioned at the LSE, international history, so the history of international relations. And then I decided, okay, I'm interested in Weimar, and so I went to another institution and studied history there. And in the beginning, my supervisor at the time, and at the time things were done differently from today, said, write an essay on why did Weimar fail? Write an essay about the economic consequences of the First World War. Write an essay. So I had to write all sorts of essays to narrow down what I might want to write my PhD on. And then I came across this book by Rudi Koschar on Marburg, a small village or town in Hesse, near Frankfurt, north of Hesse. And this was not about anti-Semitism at all. It was about social life, local politics, and Nazism. And in this book, there was an image of a poster with an anti-Semitic message on it. And this poster was not a poster produced by the Nazis, but by a right-wing conservative party. And I was astonished being naive and having not read a lot, that this party also exploited or employed anti-Semitism at the time. Okay? So that influenced me. This poster, the fact that I actually encountered it was a coincidence in a way, and it led me to think about politics and how political parties responded to anti-Semitism. I had a friend also in Oxford, and she was writing her PhD on democratization and human rights in Latin America. And I found that fascinating. And my next project, some years later, was then on democratization in West Germany because of that. So we have sort of contingency here, right? Coincidences. We can see it started perhaps with my father, with guilt, with the fact that I then encounter certain books and posters and people. But in a way, all these things I mentioned so far did not disrupt the underlying structure of what had happened before. They were confirmation. So even if one says this was coincidence, this book, right? Or meeting this person and learning about democratization, it still was part of the underlying structure. It confirmed it. My interest in Germany, my interest in how Germany became different after 45, my responses perhaps to my father and the existence in that country. So another element in the picture. I know she's not happy that I'm doing this. My wife is also in the audience, but that's my wife. And I met my wife at a conference in Jerusalem, and we worked, we met and discussed German Jewish history. So she also was a historian of German Jewish history, and that again confirmed everything that I'd been doing, and was not a rupture. But there was one thing that was a bit different, perhaps a confirmation, perhaps a rupture. That's for others to say, and I'm not that important, so we're not going to write little essays about me, but this is part of a larger story I hope that you will discover later on. The interesting thing about this little piece of the puzzle is that my wife's 4 parents, so both parents remarried, all 4 were psychologists. Okay? 4 psychologists. Now you can imagine someone fairly innocent, sort of an empirical historian, who maybe had a sense of psychology because of guilt and feelings of guilt, who had heard of Freud and all these things as well, was suddenly confronted with a real professional. Right? My wife was a professional in that respect because suddenly I heard about projection, rationalization, Oedipal complexes or Oedipal ties to my mother and so on. I was confronted with these things, and I cannot say that in the beginning I was particularly happy about this confrontation. But of course, to a certain extent, it allowed me to pursue what I was perhaps already interested in a little bit, allowed me to pursue that further. So the question is this, again, a confirmation of my concerns, my interest in guilt, on the one hand, and German history and Jewish history on the other? Or was it a rupture, a turning point, because it allowed me now to think a bit more about psychology, and eventually I then wrote a book on the reception of Freud, and so on and so forth. And of course I'm talking about these things because of psychology and history and how I got here today, and why you're sitting here and listening to someone who's talking about history and psychology. But many of the things I've been discussing so far are questions that historians ask themselves all the time. Now, historians today do all sorts of things. They do spatial history, they do social history, they do intellectual history, they do things that others, to a certain extent, also pursue or find interesting. So spatial history about the impact of spaces on human beings, geographers do that as well. Or poverty, the history of poverty. Sociologists are interested in this as well. Discourse, all sorts of people are analyzing discourse, literary scholars, English scholars. So we're sometimes dealing with similar issues. But historians are different, not better, different from others in thinking about chronology and temporal sequences and the question of whether long-term trends are more important than short-term trends, and whether certain actions disrupt these long-term trends, certain events, volatile publics who suddenly vote and vote wrongly, right? Etc. So we're thinking, be it Brexit or anything else, about the long term, the short term, about accidental happenings and whether these accidental happenings and sudden decisions made by politicians will emerge as the dominant event, the turning point, or will simply confirm, reestablish what had been going on before. So this is what we do, perhaps more than we do it. And where we differ, of course, from, let's take psychology, is that we're not interested in causal laws. So while we're sort of thinking about causality and the long term, the short term, we're not thinking about causal laws independent of time and place. Okay, this is something that's, for those familiar with those who are medievalists, something that's familiar. So Kate is in the audience, she'll know what this is all about. Historians of antisemitism have also thought about the long term, and I would argue have thought too much about the long term trends, about narratives that have been with us for such a long time that they have become dominant in many ways. And one of the dominant narratives, part of this long-term history, is, of course, the difference between Christianity and Judaism. So this is the synagogue on the right and the church on the left. And the synagogue is blindfolded. There's a lance there that's broken. That was perhaps the lance symbolically that killed Christ. There's a book falling there that is probably the Torah. So the Jews and their laws are no longer important because the Jews have been superseded or supplanted by Christianity. So the older religion is being replaced by the younger religion, and the younger religion is replacing the older religion because the Jews are blind. They have not recognized the truth that Jesus is the Messiah. And because they failed to recognize this truth many years ago, they are wandering on this earth and suffering, and they're being subjugated, and this is testament to their blindness. So this is the beginnings, in many respects, of a long story, and this is what historians of anti-Semitism have uncovered and stressed again and again. And what we have here is a repository. So within our society, at least within Western civilization, where Christianity is, of course, important, we have a repository of ideas concerning the Jews that are with us, that remain with us, and that we can access at any time because they're just there. Ideas just don't vanish. And this is sort of the long-term, one aspect of a long-term structure concerning the relationship between Jews and Christians, or Jews and others, that has been emphasized. And not just in the medieval period, but also in the early modern period, and also in the modern period, let's say from the French Revolution onwards. Something else that, of course, has become important, conspiracy theories. Okay? We're dealing with conspiracy theories all the time, but of course, one of the classic conspiracy theories is that the Jews control the world. Now, this is something that has a lot to do with emancipation. The Jews were emancipated after the French Revolution in many places. That was revoked, then they were emancipated again. But let's say from 1789 onwards, you have the process of emancipation, Jews entering mainstream society, and this is a struggle. And what is happening as a result of this emancipation is that the Jews are taking on certain positions. So they're taking on jobs, such as in banking, in trade, in the free professions, such as medicine, such as law, jobs that come naturally to them, not because of their nature, but because they were forbidden to own land in the medieval period, they were forbidden to join guilds in the medieval period. So, of course, trade became important, and within Christianity, Jews were allowed to lend money, and Christians were actually forbidden most of the time to lend money. So you have now in this emancipatory period, Jews entering certain areas disproportionately because it was part of their history. And of course, they weren't stupid, and they didn't decide in 1850, oh, I should become a farmer, because I wasn't allowed to be a farmer for the past 1,000 years, because farming was not that in and was not the future. So they had that advantage and became conspicuous slowly but surely in these areas. They became conspicuous as well because of urbanization. A lot of Jews moved to cities, like a lot of migrants or minorities do. They feel safer in cities. There are more places to come together as a small community, and they became more educated compared to others, especially compared to Catholics. They became the owners of newspapers, etc. And historians have looked at this, and again, this is sort of a long-term trend, because 100 years, 120 years, and one prominent historian has called the reaction to these developments a cultural code. So anti-Semitism became a cultural code. What does that mean? A lot of people became upset about the Jews because the Jews stood for modernity, for economic liberalism, for law, for modern literature perhaps, for all the developments that were happening at this time, especially at the end of the 19th century. And this was a cultural code, according to this historian, and many sort of have embraced this view because it included anti-modernism, anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, anti-urbanism, anti-socialism, all sorts of things. So it was a conglomerate of all sorts of feelings, and the Jews were right in the middle. You see, I have a lot of water here, and just in case, being the son of a migrant. But of course, as I said before, when I talked a little bit about my own life, we historians also think about disruptions, sudden changes, sudden events. So one event that had a huge effect on Europe, and a scholar of fascism will underline this, who's in this room, and could say a lot more about this and many more clever things about this. The First World War, its aftermath, 1918, had a huge effect. So you have these long-term trends, anti-modernism and so on and so forth, and then you have the end of empires, the end of emperors, the end of aristocracies, the end of the traditional elites after the First World War. And what happens now? How does society, in this case German society, deal with all these things, with all these new developments? Now you have a lot of elements of continuity here as well, because the anti-Bolshevism, Hitler's anti-Bolshevism, or the Nazis' anti-Bolshevism, was not something terribly new. There had been quite a bit of anti-socialism going on before. Hitler's and others' anti-capitalism was also not something terribly new, as the resistance to Manchester liberalism and economic liberalism had shown previously in previous decades. So we have continuities as well, but we have a rupture in the sense of a loss of place for many people in society, and the ability of radicals to take over and to try to dominate the scene. Not successfully in the beginning, but slowly but surely dominating the scene because of activism as well, because of violence, the politics of violence as well. And now we have anti-Semitism in power. Now, I would argue that with the Nazi period and the research going on the Holocaust, we have the first stirrings of a more psychological approach to anti-Semitism. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. But of course, Nazi Germany was a turning point because it was a regime that was anti-Semitic. That made all the difference. You could have all sorts of tendencies within society that were anti-Semitic or less so, but if you have a regime whose official policy is anti-Semitism, then the game has changed decisively. So this is a turning point, and all historians have, of course, acknowledged it. In terms of the content of this change, you have different elements that, again, demonstrate or illustrate a form of continuity. You have those for whom anti-Semitism was something redemptive. So for Hitler and some of the extreme ideologues, the notion that the Jews were the eternal enemy had something, contained elements of redemption. You get rid of this enemy and you're redeemed, you're free. Okay? And this, of course, had existed before because the racist movements, racist groups had emerged at the end of the 19th century, especially in Germany, but existed elsewhere, such as in France and other places as well. You also have a form of continuity in the shape of the so-called anti-Semitism of reason. So if you're interested, and I'm sure most of you won't be interested, but if you're interested in the major perpetrators in the offices in Berlin, planning, considering, reflecting on how to go about the Holocaust, they claim to be the anti-Semites of reason. Hitler had claimed that as well, because anti-Semitism should be pursued in a calm, cool, rational way, no emotions. We don't want to be like the rabble. We want to do it coolly, rationally, etc. So we have sort of continuities there because this idea also emerged already at the end of the 19th century among certain races. Now, for me, most interesting about the research is the literature that has emerged, that exists on the Holocaust, that emerged in the 90s by Christopher Browning, and others also wrote about this. Jacques Semelin, Aristotle also talked about these things to a certain extent, where you have social psychological aspects being introduced into the study of anti-Semitism. Browning's famous book, Police Battalion 101, did so by looking at the perpetrators on the ground. And this police battalion consisted of policemen from Hamburg, working-class policemen, who weren't hardcore Nazis at all, and who committed atrocities in the East. And he tried to find out why. And he'd argued that there was peer pressure, that there was pressure to conform, such things. So he was taking on board findings from social psychology, things we could dispute, but he tried to take these on board and think about these questions for the first time, perhaps. Maybe there are others who did this before, but for the first time, openly, how we can use social psychology to explain the perpetrators, not just ideology, not just ideology. Others, I mentioned Aristotle and Jacques Semlin, thought about the diffusion of responsibility in groups. Right? When you're in large groups, you don't feel responsible anymore. And they derive this, or scholars working in this field derive this also from social psychological findings. But all of this is really confined to the study of the Holocaust. So the study of anti-Semitism really doesn't deal with psychology all that much. If psychology is used at all, or has been used in the study of anti-Semitism, I would argue it hasn't been used in a very helpful way. Now, all the way on the left, there's Freud. On the right is Jung. And reading scholarship on anti-Semitism and psychological interpretations of anti-Semitism and so on, you'll find a lot of references, if they're psychological, to Freud. Not Jung at all, but to Freud. And Freudians had interesting things to say, and I don't want to belittle these things because they're interesting and in many ways fascinating, but they won't help us as historians and as lay people really to understand anti-Semitism. So I won't mention the individual scholars, but one of the ideas was that anti-Semitism was about the struggle between the older and the newer faith. So we're returning to this long-term trend. So what happened 2,000 years ago is still relevant in 1940 or 1950. And this long-term trend is about the father preventing the son from acting out his Oedipal desire, namely to revolt and to let his emotions reign free. The other argument was that anti-Semitism was, or this is a similar argument, anti-Semitism was the Gentile revolt, so the non-Jewish revolt, against castration anxiety. So these are the ideas, and they sound fantastical, and they are fantastical. This is sort of this idea that the Jews represent the superego, okay, the internalized conscience, the internalized, socialized conscience. That's what they represent. And the Christians, the anti-Semites, can't bear that. They can't bear the Jews being the older religion, the ones who produced the Ten Commandments. They can't bear that kind of pressure, and they have to resist it, and resist it by wielding power and force and violence. And so anti-Semitism, and specifically the Holocaust, is the murder of the conscience, the superego in the shape of the Jews. Very crazy, I know. The Jews were also uncanny. Okay? And why were they uncanny? According to this theory, they were uncanny because they were circumcised. And again, in psychoanalytical thinking at the time, circumcision represented for some the possibility of castration. Okay? So castration anxiety. So let's get rid of the Jews because we don't want to be castrated by the superego. Let's forget about these crazy ideas, but this you have in certain literature trying to explain anti-Semitism because it's about long-term trends, about the conflict that psychoanalysts believed to have identified between Jews and Christians over a long period of time. A much more interesting figure was Adorno. On the right, next to him, Horkheimer. So Adorno thought a lot about authoritarian personalities. That's why what he became famous for, especially in the United States. In Germany, he became famous for all sorts of things. And he argued that authoritarian personalities had a huge problem because they had not internalized a proper conscience, a proper superego, as the language has it, the psychoanalytical language. So because they hadn't internalized a father figure, a conscience, they needed an external figure, an external authoritarian figure. That was their problem. Because of that external figure, whenever they were frustrated, they couldn't actually attack that authoritarian figure out there who was their authority. They had to attack others. So the problem for authoritarians and for anti-Semites, according to Adorno, was that they couldn't vent their anger against those authoritarian figures out there who controlled society, who were their masters in many ways, because those were their authorities. They hadn't had internalized a proper inner authority figure, and so they had to attack others, including the Jews. This was really quite interesting, and some scholars have taken this idea and tried to explain, for instance, anti-Semitism in the modern period in terms of trying to come to grips with authoritarian figures and Jews. I won't go into this because I'm always looking at that clock, and that's making me a bit nervous. Now, the problem with this, with the psychoanalytical approach and with the authoritarian approach, is that it cannot offer us a tenable account of historical change. If we take the argument of authoritarian personalities, then the question is, why do people become authoritarian at certain times? And why do societies suddenly change at other times, even though they had supposedly been authoritarian before? The most prominent example being Germany, full of authoritarian personalities, according to Adorno, and then 10, 20, 30 years ago, a fairly democratic society moving towards democracy. So how do we actually deal with this change? The only way we can deal with this change is to argue that suddenly these people had been socialized differently, and that doesn't happen that quickly. So we can't really account for that kind of change. And this kind of thinking, authoritarian personality thinking, has huge troubles tracing change over time. What is more, it doesn't allow us to understand how societies become, if that really is the case, unauthoritarian, non-authoritarian. Because according to Adorno, what you would need in those situations would be a lot of psychotherapists analyzing people so that they get rid of their structures. Finally, just as a reminder, for historians, of course, history has been full of torture chambers, full of violence for decades, for hundreds of years. We have the Crusades, we have witches being burnt and so on. So it's not that helpful to think in terms of authoritarian figures. But there's another issue with this. And that is the issue of trying to take ideas from personality theory, personality psychology and projecting them onto social psychology. So this idea that Adorno had, and others with him, was the idea that we look at characters, we look at personalities, we look at personality structures, and then we project them onto entire societies. And you're mixing two things here. You're taking personality psychology, which is about individuals, and you're taking social psychology, which is about groups and situations, and amalgamating them and not recognizing the differences between the two. Because personality psychology is about general patterns of behavior. Okay? So if I'm an introvert, I am introverted most of the time in my life. But personality psychology does not explain how I will behave in certain situations, which social psychologists try to explain. So if we take German anti-Semitism or any kind of anti-Semitism and we look at the behavior of groups, we will have groups with introverts, with extroverts, with all sorts of people in those groups, and they will behave in a certain way in certain situations, killing, maiming, whatever, irrespective of their personalities because they have become a certain group. So one problem with the psychoanalytical approach and Adorno's approach is conflating these two. There are other problems. For instance, if we take antisocial behavior, let's imagine this is about pathological behavior. Pathological behavior doesn't work in certain situations. Now, if we think about all these authoritarian figures and perhaps pathological types, they don't work in organizations that well. On the contrary, organizations need a certain form of stability. So the Nazis had all sorts of organizations, the SS, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt that basically was responsible for the Holocaust, and you had to have fairly normal figures running these offices and organizations because such organizations and offices don't function with people suffering from antisocial behavior. One last bit concerning this. Personalities, at least this is the argument made by certain personality psychologists, exist across cultures, certain traits, you see some traits here, across certain cultures. Across time, you'll have a certain number of introverts, a certain number of extroverts, etc., etc. So these things will not help us in explaining behavior at a culture, at a certain anti-Semitic behavior in certain times and places, because we have these types of personalities everywhere, all the time. This is not very helpful information. So now to the future. The future might look like this. Moving away, perhaps, from the findings or taking on board certain findings by historians who've looked at the Holocaust, also taking on board such ideas of projection, because projection is quite important to think about why the Nazis were preoccupied with the Jews, certain Nazis, of course not all Germans, but thinking about other ways in which social psychology can help us to reflect on anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice. And one form or one idea culled from social psychology that I find particularly helpful is relative deprivation theory. Why is relative deprivation theory interesting? Now, most of you will know this. Just as an example, what is relative deprivation theory? A famous footballer in England makes £150,000 a week, and his buddy in the same team makes £180,000 a week. The first footballer is really upset about that and finds that he's deprived. Right? He's deprived, but he's only relatively deprived, and relative deprivation theory has nothing to do with actual deprivation. Does it really exist? And it doesn't necessarily have to do with individual deprivation. So I could be quite happy in my life, a house, 2 cars in a huge garage, etc., but I could feel as a group relatively deprived. A good example might be even those wealthy Germans after 1918 who felt that Germany as such was in a mess and that Germany as such was relatively deprived compared to Germany in 1913 or 1910. Now, why is this helpful, or could be helpful? Well, it's helpful because hitherto historians of anti-Semitism have obsessed about realistic conflict theory. Realistic conflict theory. Were there actual conflicts between Jews and Christians? And can we explain anti-Semitism on the basis of these real conflicts? Okay. And of course, there are concerns. There are concerns that if there was real conflicts, maybe the Jews are partially to blame. Now, we know, and most historians have uncovered this, that there might have been individual conflicts, but these individual conflicts do not explain the distortions that emerged as a result. So if, for instance, John Herbert here can stand me because I'm in the corridor with him, there's John, and I always look at him in a very aggressive way, John would be a very normal person to dislike me, but if he suddenly disliked all Jews, that's a distortion, right? That's sort of a bit crazy, right, John? Okay, so realistic conflict theory has been sort of something that historians of anti-Semitism have always thought about and said, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with this? And actually, if we look at, for instance, the pogroms in Germany as well, not just in Russia, how do we explain these? Because there was conflict, and then they uncover the fact that in one village, there was no conflict, but a pogrom. And there was a pogrom because of conflict. So these things are sometimes a bit complex. And to avoid always thinking about, was there really a conflict? Because often there weren't conflicts. Much of the anti-Semitism had, of course, nothing to do with real-life conflicts. We can think much harder about relative deprivation theory. Because relative deprivation theory is about imagining things, fantasies, emotions, regardless of personal situations, and we can reframe the question and think about perceptions of social and cultural capital. So relative deprivation theory has perhaps moved us away from a preoccupation with deep structures, and we're looking at we're zooming in a little bit, right? I feel relatively deprived because this footballer next to me. Or I feel relatively deprived because the Jews used to be downtrodden. And what the hell's going on? Now they're doing better. I'm doing fine, but they're doing better. That bothers me. That shouldn't be the case because for hundreds of years, the Jews were the ones who suffered. Okay? So that should not change. So it's not about how I feel personally because I have my garage or at the time I have my coach or who knows what. So we're moving down, we're focusing a little bit more, moving away maybe from deep structures, Christianity versus Judaism, etc., and individual psyches that might be bad. But still, imaginations do not necessarily kill. Right? Imaginations, fantasies, and so on, we still need to do the killing. This is killing or violence happening in 1819 in German towns during pogroms at the time. So let's try to look at even more concrete situations. Okay, so this is pretty damn concrete. Can you still hear me? Okay. We're zooming in. We're thinking about the Nazi movement and how people become attracted to the Nazi movement, and moreover, how people become active in persecuting Jews, attacking Jews, destroying their property, perhaps in the end killing them. And one way to do that is to consider another model idea from social psychology called, nasty word, self-categorization theory. Self-categorization theory, because it might be able to help us a little bit more. And this has to do with how groups emerge in certain situations. And it's directed against the old school of thought that had a lot to do with crowds being full of irrational, effeminate, working class men and women, and these people losing control in masses. Right? This was the idea that emerged at the end of the 19th century. Le Bon is a famous theorist of this idea, that you give up your personality, de-individuation it's called, in groups and masses, and that's something bad. Self-categorization theory is not interested in loss of identity. It's interested in change of identity. So it's not about losing my individuality because I join a group, but I'm changing my categorization, my self-categorization, because of this group. So that waxes and wanes in all sorts of situations, also amongst us. One example, there are all sorts of experiments. I'm not a psychologist, but an example would be that if you self-identify as an American and as a woman, the tendency is that you're more anti-Muslim. If you self-categorize yourself as a student at a liberal arts institution in the United States, the likelihood is that you're less anti-Muslim. Okay? That is because of the way in which you self-categorize yourself, or the way in which you categorize yourself, depending on certain situations. Now, this is quite helpful in thinking about how, and then one would zoom in as a historian and look at exactly what was happening, how, for example, Germans more and more categorized themselves as being different from Jews, even more so perhaps than in the past, and how others, and we're not just dealing with antisemitism, self-categorize themselves in certain ways in order to oppose other groups. So Jewish cattle dealers become no longer neighbors, but become enemies, for example. This would be a classic example that has been looked at a bit. But more importantly, if we look at people stealing, maiming, raping, killing, you could use these examples and say that through self-categorization, you're changing what you're actually doing. You're not raping, maiming, etc. You're doing these things because you're protecting the purity of the German people, of the Aryan race. That's a result, perhaps, of self-categorization. I heard some tone peeping there. I don't know whether that's meant for me, but it also means that in the process of self-categorizing yourself, you blame the victims, right? Victims are blamed because you are doing all these things to the victims and saying this must be for a reason that these things are happening. Last thing. How does self-categorization work? If we zoom down a little bit further, we might consider cognitive dissonance. Okay, so cognitive dissonance is this idea of trying to deal with your own self-image in certain situations, for example. So if you're maiming someone, attacking someone, and you've learned that you shouldn't maim or attack human beings, then you have to restructure, no problem, you have to restructure your self-image, because there's a cognitive dissonance there, right? You're being asked to kill Jews, or you're being asked to steal from Jews, or you're being asked to do all sorts of things to Jews or others, but you have learned otherwise. So you're trying to find a solution for that, those feelings of cognitive dissonance. And you can do that either before the action even takes place, and this is what regimes do. So if a regime like the Nazi regime has its propaganda machine and uses its propaganda machine, it tries to preempt the cognitive dissonance by saying you need to do it for the sake of the German people, so that perhaps cognitive dissonance never actually takes place in the first place. Or it happens after the events to explain what was happening. So you do certain things and you say, I had to do it. Yeah? It was actually good that I did it because I had to do it. It was no longer bad. Now, one could look at all sorts of examples, the most prominent being the Holocaust, but smaller examples also existed even at the end of the 19th century. If we look at farmers in the German countryside, for example, who were on very friendly terms with their Jewish neighbors. Sometimes they lit the candles on the Sabbath. They invited them to festivities, but at the same time they voted for anti-Semitic parties. So how are they dealing with this cognitive dissonance? Eventually, they would decide that voting for anti-Semites was more important than the neighborly relationships. And one can trace how this happened. So in 2004, I promised to myself that I would never study anti-Semitism again. That's a long time ago. I had written 2 books, one on political anti-Semitism in the Weimar Republic, one on how Germans democratized, and I said, that's enough. Awful. Yeah? Awful subject, depressing. I want to stop it. In 2015, looking at hypnosis and becoming interested in the history of hypnosis, I encountered a social psychological idea called role expectancy theory, which suggested that people actually never entered a trance during hypnosis, but expected to be in a trance. So the expectation of becoming hypnotized was all that was needed for people to fall asleep. But there was no physical trance. There was no actual physiological state that they were in. So I became interested in social psychology. At about the same time, anti-Semitism was raising its ugly head in Europe again. All over the place, in Hungary, in France, in Germany. I'm not going to mention nowadays Corbyn, and because I don't know enough about Corbyn, I must admit, and what's happening in the Labour Party. And so in 2017, I decided to reconsider looking at anti-Semitism, based also on my new interest in social psychology. Now, this return can be explained with the structures that were in place when I was born. They can be explained with recourse to my father. It could be my own self-categorization of becoming more Jewish, not in a religious sense, but in responding to the anti-Semitism out there. So feeling I have to self-categorize differently and become more self-conscious in this sense. It could be because of my growing cognitive dissonance, because on the one hand, I said, anti-Semitism, never again. And on the other hand, I'm seeing what's happening all over the place, and how am I going to respond to this cognitive dissonance? Which side am I going to take? Or it could be my need to pay tribute to impact case studies and these things, where anti-Semitism sounds a little bit sexier than the history of hypnosis. Whatever it might be, if I should continue on the course of being a historian, and should Kiel continue to exist for a time being, and there are all things that might happen, we don't know, then it might be that the study of anti-Semitism plus psychology will be the things I'm going to do till I look like this old person there in the coming years. Thank you for coming. Thank you for paying attention to me.